All right, so we're back in my office for this week, whatever we call our timeline of vlogs, and we've actually had some requests from our viewers. We have viewers now.
I know, it's very exciting. We have viewers.
It is exciting. One of the sort of more off-topic / interesting topics that we were asked to cover was famous horses. So
Very broad topic.
It is a broad topic, and we struggled with it a little bit. I mean, of course, there are a lot of famous horses out there, but we're going to try to run through some this week.
Very exciting, and we learned a lot too.
We did learn a lot, and hopefully you will as well.
All right, so to start us off, we're going to talk about Secretariat. And many of you know he has a great race record. He is a Triple Crown winner, and to this day holds many of the records for the 3 legs of the Triple Crown.
Yeah.
And for more information and a video about that, click into this little box here.
Great. And so one of the reasons that Secretariat, or thought to be one of the reasons that he was such a great racehorse, among many, was the size of his heart. So Secretariat's heart weighed around 22 pounds, and that's comparison to the average horse, which probably weighs around 7 to 8 pounds. What that means from a scientific perspective is that he was really capable of pumping a lot more blood around his body and delivering oxygen to his working muscles, allowing him to run a lot faster.
Our next horse is Trigger, and Trigger was made famous as Roy Rogers' horse. He was also was named Golden Cloud, so that was an interesting fact. Before he was famous as Roy Rogers' horse, he was in a motion picture called The Adventures of Robin Hood, and you can see a clip by clicking here.
Excellent. And Trigger obviously couldn't fulfill all the roles that he needed to in all these personal appearances around the country. And so Roy Rogers actually had 2 other horses. He had Little Trigger and Trigger Jr. Right, so it's kind of interesting to note that all of the different Triggers were actually of different breedings. So Trigger himself was half thoroughbred, and we're not really sure what his dam was. Cold-blooded mare, she's described as some places. Little Trigger, we don't know anything about except that he was kind of a quarter type horse.
Okay.
And finally, Trigger Jr. was actually a Pennsylvania-bred Tennessee walking stallion.
Nice.
Probably the most well-bred of all 3 of them. And so kind of interesting that he was from here in Pennsylvania too. Okay, and so next on our list is Silver, the Lone Ranger's horse. And as with many of these movie / TV personalities, you know what? There was more than one Silver. When you have more than one Silver, well, I mean, with any actor, you know, there's more than one Andrea and Bert. You guys just don't know it. We all look the same. With Silver, there was one that was a little more laid back. He had a nice looking rear, but maybe he wasn't quite
rear as in up into the air.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That is pretty good. The other one was pretty good looking, but kind of afraid of being in front of the camera. So they kind of needed to use both. Kind of interesting.
Yeah, and great fact was the Lone Ranger actually started out as a radio show.
That's right.
So nobody really thought about having to do public appearances. But then when he was in high demand, they had to kind of backpedal and be like, whoa, we need horses for this.
Like?
So then they kind of scrambled and found the 2 Silvers.
Speaking of the Lone Ranger.
The Lone Ranger had a sidekick named Tonto.
He did.
And Tonto's horse was named Scout.
He was.
So we're going to talk a little bit about Scout.
Based on what I've seen in some mock-ups and toys, that Scout was thought to be a pinto.
Okay, and that's different from a paint?
Supposedly it is, yes. And so I went and looked a little bit of this up because, you know, I, of course, like to learn about this and pass some of this knowledge along to you all. So what's the difference between an American paint horse and a pinto horse? Apparently, this is a frequently asked question. So briefly, the answer to that is American paint horses are limited to registered bloodlines of paint, American quarter horse, and thoroughbred horses, whereas pinto can be from an array of bloodlines, including Arabian, American saddlebred,
What are those?
American miniature horses, Tennessee walking horses, American Shetland ponies, to name a few. The Pinto Horse Association does not accept Appaloosa, draft, or mule breedings and/or characteristics, except for non-characteristic Appaloosa geldings. I'll let you figure that out on your own. A pinto horse must have 4 square inches of cumulative white in the qualifying zone and underlying pink skin. The requirement is modified with the size of the equine, requiring only 3 square inches for ponies and 2 square inches for miniatures. So you can have a miniature Scout.
And now you know.
All right, to change gears a little bit, we're going to talk about Seabiscuit. He was a famous racehorse in the early 30s to mid-30s. Again, many of our viewers will be familiar with the movie and the book by Laura Hildebrand. And one of the things that's kind of interesting from a scientific perspective about Seabiscuit was the fact that his conformation and size were not typical of what you would expect for a really successful racing thoroughbred. His heart was particularly large. He really wasn't much to look at, I guess. You know, conformationally, you wouldn't have thought so.
And an interesting fact about his name, he was named after his father, Hardtack, which is a cracker eaten by sailors. So Seabiscuit is another term for that. That's where his name comes from.
There you go.
The next horse is Fury, and Fury was a TV series. The lead character, the horse, was actually an American saddlebred born named Highlandale.
Interesting. And even more interestingly is that Fury was trained by Ralph McCutcheon, who was a famous trainer, and all of the shows and movies that you're seeing scroll up on the screen right now were movies in which Ralph McCutcheon trained the horses. So a pretty illustrious career, and you think about what he had to do to train all these horses for those movies and shows. It's pretty amazing what some of them did. Mr. Ed, speaking of TV personalities, you and I are just talking about this. This horse's original name was Bamboo Harvester. I'm sorry, we have many of these names, but who names their horse Bamboo Harvester?
Apparently this guy.
I mean, really?
Oh, Mr. Ed was a step up.
Perhaps he was, and thank goodness he had the successful career he had, but Bamboo Harvester?
We can't change it.
No, we can't. So, there's a lot of myths among many of these stories, and so one of them is that the way they made Mr. Ed talk was, have you heard this one?
Peanut butter.
Yeah.
I heard that was the thing I heard. They used peanut butter in his lips.
Well, that's not true. And actually, you can check out this YouTube video here. There's actually an interesting little clip about what they actually did to train him, so you guys can watch that. But it's kind of interesting to look at what they did. And supposedly, Mr. Ed eventually learned to talk without any cues. Now, he didn't actually talk, but he moved his lips around, and he would do it whenever the actors stopped speaking. That's what you're supposed to do now. I stopped speaking.
The next horse is going to be Champion. This was Gene Autry's horse that was well trained in a lot of dance moves, actually, which is the interesting facts. The hula and the Charleston, as Dr. Stan is trying to do right now. Obviously, Champion was much better trained than Bert here at dancing. He actually traveled with Gene Autry around the globe and received monthly thousands and thousands of letters for fan mail. Very famous.
If we read them all. All right, so Hidalgo next. I would say this is near the top of one of my favorite horse movie lists, and supposedly based on a true story, but I do want to highlight, everybody should go watch the movie. It's a fantastic one.
It is a great movie, and after some research, we kind of found that the movie role, Frank Hopkins, the writer, who actually was a famous person for training endurance horses, had his own bloodlines that he produced. Supposedly, he was invited over to Arabia to compete in this grueling endurance race with his horses, 2 horses.
Made for a good movie.
Yeah, absolutely, right? And then when Disney came out, or I can't remember who produced the movie, said it was based on a true story, people started digging up some interesting tidbits, and a controversy ensued, where Frank Hopkins was known to be this grand storyteller. They found storytelling books and how to weave a tale, found all sorts of books in his home. He's talked to many people about all his stories. So it started unraveling whether this actually was a true story or not, or how much fact this was based on. Go ahead, do some research on your own, but Hidalgo, in fact, or not in fact, is based on a true story. Next up, Bucephalus, also the warhorse of Alexander the Great.
Right. His name derives from being sort of bull-headed or ox-headed.
Okay.
And apparently Alexander's father bought him for what in today's term would be about $1 million. And that was back then, so it's probably even more than that.
I would imagine inflation and whatnot.
$1 million. And this is, again, one of those classic stories of nobody else was able to ride this horse except Alexander, and then they went on to live this long, happy life together. Yeah.
Ruffian was a famous filly who won many races. She actually was labeled the Queen of the Fillies after she won the Eclipse Award. And unfortunately, one of the tragic things that happened, the tragic thing that happened to Ruffian, in a match race that they held against her and the previous Kentucky Derby winner, she blew out her both forelegs in the race. And the jockey actually had a horrible time pulling her up because she did not want to lose the race. They actually performed surgery on her. She came out of the surgery and unfortunately had to be euthanized closely thereafter. This brought up in the public's eye, because the public fell in love with her, some of the controversy with racing, and because this was on a public stage, there was a public outcry for racing and the fact that this filly had to be put down because she was racing.
Sounds like a story we've heard before.
Yes.